Wow, 5 goals in a game against the Czechs? Can't ask for much more than that. Hey, US, you guys coming? Oh, sorry, they're still under review for something. Gold medal, let's go! Welcome back to On the Fly. We're previewing the predicting and recapping World Junior Championships, our Men's World Championships, the Women's World Championship, the U18 Men's World Championship. Expect the unexpected.
Absolute abomination of the Canadian Junior National Team.
I have a couple extra words I want to use on that one. And it's Freebird. Freebird. Of course, the Olympics are just around the corner. I'm gonna coin it the rivalry day.
World Junior history!
Your home for international hockey. This is On the Fly. Hello everyone, welcome back to On the Fly. Here, recapping day 2 of the men's Olympic hockey event happening in Milano, Cortina, Italy. So we'll hop into today, starting with the scores from today's game, starting with a 4-0 victory for Switzerland over France. Now this game coming in for the Swiss was one that, frankly, they were expected to win and expected to dominate. And you look at this game, and it was a little bit of that, but I'd say the general gist of this can best be described over the course of 3 periods. You know, the first period, very much controlled by the Swiss. They looked very good. You get out to a few quick goals and everything is sunshine and rainbows. And then you move to the second period and it's a little bit less great. And we see the French kind of fight their way back in, and they made it a little bit of an interesting game. Yes, obviously the Swiss still held their score and you can see the final, but you were waiting for the French to kind of put their way through and get that goal on the board to try and turn the tide. And as much as it didn't come in today's game, I do think that the French really showed themselves well today, especially in that second period. And then the third period, it went a little bit more back to what was expected with the Swiss controlling much of the play. But you look at this game for the Swiss, and I think it's one that, as much as, yes, they end up winning, they end up scoring 4 goals with a 4-goal differential, it definitely will help them down the line, but you wanted to see a full 60-minute from them, especially with the fact that goal differential is so important at this tournament. And as they look ahead, they're going to have to go through both the Czechs and Canada now, where that game is going to be extremely tough. And in a tournament like this, where every goal does matter, you were hoping, at least for the Swiss, to see them kind of find those extra goals against the French today. Fortunately, they didn't really do that. They played a little bit of an interesting game, not their best, but still good enough to get the win. They will take up the 3 points with the 4-0 win. For France today, they played a decent game, especially later on, but definitely outmatched. A 4-0 win for Switzerland over France. They do pick up a big 3 points in the standings. Then to the second game of today between Canada and Czechia. And this was another game coming in that I wouldn't say went terribly to expectation. You look at the Canadian squad, and they're a good one this year. And I don't think anyone was anticipating as good as they are, especially after what they played in that game against the Czechs. But you look at the Canadians at this tournament, obviously they're gold medal contenders, whether it's them or the US that you put number 1. I do think that today they really answered a lot of the question marks that at least I had coming into this tournament, whether it was their offensive production, especially with their line combinations, which still to me are a little bit out of whack, but at least it's working, and we saw that today. Or you can look at the goaltending in net of, is Jordan Binnington going to go back to being not so good of a goaltender, or is he going to find his game and be exactly what this Canadian team is going to need? And so today you saw all of those question marks answered, and in a very pungent way. And for the Canadians, I thought that this game was the exact game that they needed to start the tournament. They're going to look to continue this success. A huge game coming up tomorrow against Switzerland, and if they can play anything like they did today against the Czechs, they might be able to go out and win not only the top seed out of the group, get to bypass the Swedes, but then from there go on to end up winning this tournament, which also would not surprise me in the slightest. This Canadian team has shown themselves extremely well so far, and I think there's no better example of that than their physicality, which we saw some of their star players laying the boom early on. When you have Connor McDavid leveling guys on the ice, especially for him, who's not necessarily known for his physicality. Then you have Nathan McKinnon, dropping shoulders as well. And so it goes to show what kind of team this Canadian squad is going to be this year. Extremely exciting to see them playing as well as they are, and we'll see if they're able to carry it forward through the rest of the tournament. As for the Czechs today, and it was a little bit more the other way, and as much as, yes, you go up against the Canadians, it's always going to be a tough game when you play them. I didn't think that they played all that well. And yes, they played all right, but especially when you go up against a team like the Canadians, you need to be playing better than your best. And I didn't think the Czechs really had it that level today. I know a lot of people think they did, and a lot of people were okay with the effort, but you look to some more of that depth type scoring for them. And frankly, I think part of it has to do with the line combinations. I do expect Cervenka to at some point to kind of drop up or find his way up the lineup, because you do need multi-levels of lines. And as much as you put the top NHL line, of course, with the big three at the top of the Czech lineup, you do jeopardize the rest of your team's at least scoring ability, and that allows teams like Canada, who have that kind of defensive shutdown line, to go up against that big line for the Czechs. And so I don't really think that's going to be something they're going to continue, at least I hope not, for the sake of the Czechs. They're going to need to have and really find some depth scoring. They're going to go up against the France tomorrow. We'll see whether or not they're going to be able to find that, especially against a relatively weak French team. Definitely something to keep an eye on for the Czech squad as they head into tomorrow's game. But Canada's take this one 5-0, your final. Another big 3 points in the standings early on here, especially against a really good Czech team, and even more so, a huge 5-goal differential against the Czechs. And then we'll lead on to the third game of the day between the USA and Latvia. And in this game, I was kind of an expected result. And what I'd say about Latvia today is they were outmatched coming in. You look at the US on paper, you look at the Latvians. It was ultimately going to come down to whether or not the Latvians were going to be able to get some good goaltending in net and play some good defensive hockey. And I wouldn't say either of those things were overly true, with Merzlikins being a fairly early exit from this game. He left after the second period. Artur Shilovs ended up coming in for the Latvians in this game, and that was, in my eyes, always going to be the ending of what was to come in the goaltending situation, as Shilovs was going to be the eventual goaltender. But I don't know if I was expecting to be that soon. I thought Merzlikins would have at least got through the first game, but he didn't. And so for Latvia today, as much as you lose this game, I do still think that most of these teams in the group, whether it's Germany, whether it's the Danes, are going to end up getting smoked by a team like the US. So just because they lose today, I don't think it's kind of that panic button quite yet. But you do want to see them play a little bit better defensive hockey, not allow players into the middle of the ice, free lanes coming right down the slot. You need to make sure you're cleaning those areas up if you want any shot at contending at this tournament, much less upsetting teams like the Germans and then going and trying to beat the Danes. Definitely something to keep your eyes on. For the U.S. today, they played a really solid game today. Very few blemishes. Yes, they had a little bit of a weak stretch early on in the game, but kind of expected, especially with the NHL players kind of gaining that chemistry early on. We've seen teams like Canada, a little bit less today, but teams like the Finns, teams like the Swedes kind of struggle early on in this tournament, especially trying to find that footing. So credit to them today for pushing through that and eventually finding their game, a 5-1 win to close it out for the U.S. Then the last game of the day between Germany and Denmark. And it was today for me that kind of factor. And we talk about it a lot in these videos, and there's some things you just can't really find the words for, because you look for certain players to be your star talent. And we'll talk about it as well in our news section for the Germans, but when you have your best players playing at their best, it makes your life significantly easier. And for the Germans, there's two guys you always look for, Leon Draisaitl and Tim Stützle. And for the Germans today, that was their 3 goals. And for the Danes, you can kind of pull off the same effect. Nikolai Ehlers was the one who ended up setting up the goal for the Danes. And you always look to your key players to be key players in this tournament. And even more so, you look for your goaltending to be at its best. And I think for both these teams today, they got good goaltending, and they also got good efforts from their top players. And ultimately, at the very end of this game, it came down to which team's star players were better. And for the Germans today, that was the difference maker. They scored the 3 goals. For the Danes, they only get the 1. And once again, that's your game, a 3-1 victory for the Germans today over Denmark. I really liked Denmark's game today, I will add. I thought they played a really good game and unfortunately just found themselves on the wrong side of the stick. But very well could have went the other way. They get a few lucky bounces in there. Grubauer doesn't make the saves he does. The Danes could have very well come out with this game. But in the end, Germany pulled through a 3-1 victory for them. A huge 3 points over in the Group C standings, as we'll now shift over to the news section of today, starting here with the Swiss with Wakey Wakey. And for the Swiss, it was one of those games where you do need to make sure you are playing a full 60 minutes. And yes, you're going up against France, who are not necessarily the most competitive of teams, but when you go and play teams like the Czechs, like Canada, when you take those naps, especially in your own end, especially when you're taking longer gaps of kind of that rest, you're going to get countered and they're going to score. And so for the Swiss, as much as today, a relatively meaningless game for them, taking on France, you're expected to win, you're expected to blow them out, and they still outplayed them. It wasn't the kind of game I don't think that the Swiss would have wanted to play. They do need to wake up at this tournament. A huge game coming tomorrow against Canada. We'll see just how well they can play. If they can clean it up defensively, play a really good 200-foot game, it would not surprise me to see the Swiss team pull off an upset. They're a very good team at this tournament, a very underrated team as well. But at the same time, the Canadian team is really good, and we saw that today, just how good they were. Then to France with chances, and for the French today, they had quite a few chances, especially in that second period, and we'll see whether or not they're going to be able to keep that going through the rest of this tournament. They're going to be one of those chippy-type teams. Whether or not they're going to be able to contend at this tournament still remains to be seen. It's going to be a real tough group for them. Obviously, that fourth team in that death group of the Swiss, Canada, and the Czechs, they probably are going to have played their easiest opponent today against Switzerland. As far as the matchup goes, not saying that the Swiss are worse than the Czechs or the Czechs worse than the Swiss. They're pretty equal, but more so just in the very end as far as the matchups go for the French, who they'd rather play. And so I'd say that's likely going to be the Swiss. I expect the Czechs, when they play them tomorrow, to really take it to them. Wouldn't surprise me to see that game end in a blowout. And then, of course, Canada, who is well expected to blow out this French team. For France today, we'll see if they can continue making those and generating those chances. So if they can, they might make it a very interesting tournament. Then to Canada with the wow factor. And I don't normally, and for those who don't know, the jerseys behind me, the way that it works is the jersey on my far left or right, depending on which side of this video you're watching on, is always the host country. And then the other two jerseys behind me are teams that either impressed me today or won the games or some version of that. And so I very rarely end up putting the Canada jersey behind me. The majority of our audience that watches these videos isn't Canadian, so I like to kind of spread the love a little bit, especially with the Canada hat as well. But today in particular, after their game against the Czechs, I felt especially inclined to put this Canada jersey up behind me. This was arguably the most impressive game, I'd say, out of any of the teams we saw at this tournament so far today. You look for the Canadians as a team that wanted to try and win this tournament. Coming in, it was gold or bust for them. They knew what was at stake, especially early on when it was going to be difficult for them to find that goal differential, but they found it. And I think they answered a lot of questions today around whether their goaltending was going to be good enough to go far in this tournament. It was going to be a question mark whether their offensive lines, especially on their forward side, which is in a bit of a shamble right now, was going to be okay and it was going to work. It did. And then on their defensive side, whether or not that was going to be able to keep pace with the best on best, and it did. And so for the Canadians today, the wow factor for me extends far beyond just them winning this game by a pretty good margin. It's the way that they played too, and they are dangerous moving forward in this tournament. Definitely a team to watch. We'll be coming out with our power rankings later, and I will spoil it in this video. Canada is now going to be moving to the #1 seed. If they can play like they did today against the U.S., they will beat the U.S. by a margin. I'm excited for if it ends up getting that far down the line, but it is definitely a good step in the right direction for this Canadian team. We'll see, of course, if they can continue it through the rest of the tournament. Big game coming up tomorrow against the Swiss, so stay tuned for that. But then move on to the Czechs with ouch. And it's never easy starting a tournament going up against arguably the best team at this tournament, and now we're calling the best team at this tournament. For the Czechs today, you wanted to see what they were going to be able to do. And I thought that as much as, yes, they didn't play a terribly great game, they had their chances, didn't really bury them. But I do think that something needs to change, whether it's spreading out their lines, whether or not it's kind of getting some more production from the top side. I think for the Czechs, they're going to look to try and win those key games. They have a huge one coming up against the Swiss later on in the tournament. They can win that game. They set themselves up in a very good spot moving forward through the rest of the tournament, even with the loss today against the Canadians. Something to keep an eye on there for the Czechs. With ouch today, we'll see what they can do tomorrow. Then to Latvia, they were just outskilled today. So sometimes it's just one of those games for teams like Latvia that you tip your hat, you accept it, and just kind of acknowledge that, the U.S. came to play today. They had a better team on paper, and they didn't let teams like Latvia kind of throw a wrench into their system. For teams like the U.S., we'll talk about the U.S., they're designed so that if they do go up against teams like Latvia, the Latvians are going to clog the middle, they're going to cause problems. And for teams, and when the U.S. finds those gaps, and they did today, they're going to end up winning those games. And unfortunately for teams like Latvia, there's not much you can do about that. You play your best system. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And you tip your hat in at the end of the day. That's all you can do. And so for Latvia today, we're just outskilled in that one. Then to the U.S. with the depth. And coming into this tournament for the U.S., I think there was no one more disregarded, or whatever word you want to use, not wanted on this U.S. team than the mix of JT Miller, Brock Nelson, and then I have to include the last guy on the list, Jack Hughes, although he was more or less wanted on this team. But coming in today, obviously players not necessarily wanted on this U.S. roster. Big question marks around, well, they can't produce as well as players like Jason Robertson and Cole Caulfield. And I think today hopefully silenced those critics. You look at the goals scored today and the goals disallowed as well, I might reinforce. Those goals all came from Brock Nelson and JT Miller. And two guys who you look to, I guess, generate offense now, not just being a defensive piece, which I think that as this tournament eventually shifts forward and the U.S. starts to play better teams, like Canada, like the Swedes, they're going to transition more into that defensive role. But when they can find the offense and the U.S. can get some depth scoring, it makes them such a more dangerous team. And I think that's one of the best parts for the U.S. today. One of the biggest positives that they'll draw is that they're not just a one-line team, or I guess a three-line team in this case. They are a four-line team who can all generate offense, and we'll see if they can continue that into tomorrow, or into of course, Saturday's games. As they look ahead, the U.S. is looking really good. And as much as today, they've had a little bit of struggle early on, found their game towards the end, I do think it's a sign of good things to come for them. We'll see, of course, whether or not they are going to be able to keep it going. The U.S. today, with the depth scoring, that really helped them get over the edge against the Latvians. Then to the Germans with the stars shine. And we talked about it already. You want your best players to be your best players at this tournament. For Germany today, their stars did shine with Tim Stützle and Leon Draisaitl combining for all three of their goals. Huge performance by them, leading Germany to the promised land. Then to Denmark it was a good start today. And I know that the end result isn't exactly what you wanted, but they showed themselves very well. And I think that effort kind of carries them through the rest of this tournament, especially if they can find a little bit of puck luck along the way. Don't be surprised to see a team like the Danes kind of make their impact at this tournament. Team to definitely keep your eye on as they do look to try and pull off some upsets along the way. Definitely a team that could very well do that. You look at their team composition, look at them at the most recent Men's World Championship as well, where they pulled off the arguably one of the biggest upsets at that tournament, defeating Canada with, of course, Nathan McKinnon, Sidney Crosby, and Macklin Celebrini all on that team. And so for the Danes, we'll see whether or not they are going to be able to continue that success. Definitely a good start today for them. We'll shift over now to the standings. And we'll start here, of course, in Group A, where we'll see Canada and Switzerland both in first place with 3 points. Czechia and France both in third and last spot in Group A with 0 points, 1 regulation loss. For Group B, Sweden and Slovakia both in first place with 3 points. Finland and Italy both in the last spot with 0. Over to Group C, you have the USA and Germany, both in the top spot with 3 points, and then Denmark and Latvia, both in last place with 1 regulation loss. We'll switch over now to tomorrow's games. We'll start here bright and early at 6:10 a.m. Eastern time. Might be tomorrow or today when you're watching this, probably will be, between Sweden and Finland. A huge game coming up over in Group B. You look at these two teams, one of the best rivalries in all of sports between the Swedes and the Finns. And for the Swedes, for the Finns, two teams that haven't exactly got off to the start that they were hoping for. You look at the game for the Swedes against the Italians. They couldn't really find that offensive punch. Got goalied a little bit, but kind of struggled a little bit as well. For the Finns, it was the complete opposite. They didn't play all that well, and we'll see whether or not they're going to be able to play their best game like they did at Four Nations against this Swedish team, and who knows, maybe pull off an upset along the way. I do think the advantage definitely favors the Swedes, although this game wouldn't surprise me to see to go to overtime. I think in our prediction video, we ended up having this game go to overtime with, I believe it was the Swedes pulling through. I think it was a 3-2 victory, if memory serves off the top of my head. But you look at this game, and it could go either way. The Finns play a very defensive style. The Swedes play a very offensive style. And it's going to eventually come down to which team brings their best game. You look at the Swedes so far, they had a really good game against the Italians, didn't have the results in it. We'll see whether or not that kind of lack of scoring ends up hurting them in the end against the Finns, who are going to play a relatively similar style to that Italian team. Of course, their former coach is now the coach of the Italian team for the Finns. We'll see whether or not that has any impact on their game tomorrow. So big game coming up at the top of the day. Your game of the day between Finland and Sweden at 6:10 a.m. Eastern. Then to the second game between Italy and Slovakia. This will be an interesting one as well, 6:10 a.m. Eastern. For the Slovaks, you're going to look for them to kind of earn their way through. And for the Slovaks, once again, remember back to their last game against Finland, where they pulled off a quote-unquote upset, a big win for sure in Group B as they try and move themselves up the standings. And with that win, they more or less get themselves in a pretty good spot. And then from there, it becomes, can they sneak into that 4th spot in the group and get that easier quarterfinal seed or get a bye to the quarterfinals? And so if they can do that, and they are in a decent spot, you look across the groups, the Germans today with a tight margin win over the Danes. You look at, of course, Group A as well, where the Czechs just got pummeled 5-0. It's definitely a potential for this Slovak team to try and sneak into that 4th spot across the groups. They're going to need a big win and a very convincing win against the Italians tomorrow. So if they start to run up score, that's going to be the reason why. Look for the Slovak team to pull off a really big margin win tomorrow against the Italians. Should be an interesting game in that one. Then to the third game between Czechia and France at 10:40 a.m. Eastern time. I expect this one to be a bit of a blowout. I don't think it'll be terribly close. Still going to be an interesting game, though, for the Czechs, who didn't play all that well today, had some decent looks, but not kind of that finishing touch that we're accustomed to with this team. We'll see whether or not they can pick it up against the French as they look to try and, once again, earn their goal differential at this tournament. 10:40 a.m. between Czechia and France. Then to the last game of the day between Canada and Switzerland, your other game of the day for this one. 3:10 p.m. Eastern time. You have Canada coming off of quite an impressive performance against the Czechs. The Swiss coming off of a decent performance against the French. We'll see whether or not the Canadians are able to continue their success into their game against the Swiss. Games of the day tomorrow, Sweden and Finland, 6:10 a.m. Canada and the Swiss at 3:10 p.m. Your other games, Italy and Slovakia, 6:10, and France and the Czechs at 10:40 a.m. Eastern time. But that will do it today for our scheduled content. We will now go into viewer questions. We do put out a poll on our Twitter, X, and YouTube page at the end of the last game of the end of the second period of the last game of the day, asking for your thoughts and questions on the day. We have 2 comments from today. We'll start with one from Nick, the IIHF fan, who says, for Canada Czechia, people will be focused on the 5-0 scoreline, but I think the defense should be shouted as well as Binnington with the 26 save shutout. They got the job done just as much as the scorers did. And that's a fair point. And you look especially coming into this tournament, I know we talked about it already, but worth repeating, that for a guy like Jordan Binnington, the question mark, especially coming into this tournament, was his play in the NHL going to carry over into this Canadian Olympic team? And I think he really answered the question today with that, with no, it's not. And it was good to see. It was good to see him come back to his kind of that standard classic Jordan Binnington, Team Canada, big game moment flow. But that's the kind of game you need to see from your goaltending, especially at a tournament like the Olympics, if you want any shot at competing. And so for the Canadians today, a huge deal that you have a goaltender that's going to be able to play. You also talk about all the scoring from different lines you got. Definitely a sign of good things to come for this Canadian team. But we'll go over to the second comment now from Zerdugal, who says, despite watching all of Latvia versus USA, of course, I don't understand how we did so badly in the second period. And what I'd say about that is, as much as, yes, you know, the Latvians didn't have as good of a second period, say, as the US did, I think it's also the fact that for a team like Latvia, you're holding on in those types of games. Not necessarily pushing the pace or kind of finding those gaps. You're just trying to hold on. You're trying to wait out teams like the US, you know, because you can win a 1-1 game with 10 minutes left in the third, but it's a lot more difficult to win a 1-1 game with 40 minutes left to play. And the other thing to kind of keep an eye on, especially for teams like Latvia, is the closer they can keep teams, you know, like the US, like Canada, the better they're going to end up having as far as results go. And so they're trying to hold on as long as possible, but sometimes what that means is you get overly defensive. Sometimes that means that teams like the US find that offensive gaps, start to neutralize and find those kind of seams, and they walk in and they score goals. And so we saw that a little bit today, that the Latvians just looked a little bit out of touch with what they were trying to do, and not necessarily fault of their own. The US is a very good team, and they force a lot, especially for teams like Latvia, who's trying to play a very structured style. It can be difficult to defend. We've seen that across the board at just about every other international event, and I think that's one of the biggest differences between the the Latvian team we saw today versus Latvian teams we've seen in the past, is that the US today really forced the agenda. The Latvians didn't really have a chance to get set up in the defensive end, and that ultimately ended up costing them goals. And so we'll move ahead, of course, now to our final part of the day with what is going to happen tomorrow. And huge day coming up, right? You have some big games in Group B with the Finns and the Swedes, could be fighting for the top spot. With as well, you look at the Slovak team trying to creep into a potential three-way tie for the first place. You look for teams trying to win by a margin tomorrow, but should be an interesting game. You also have, of course, Canada and the Swiss, two teams fighting for now the top spot in Group A, and we'll see which version of those two teams come out. Big games coming up tomorrow, Slovakia and Italy as well, Czechia and France. Be sure to come back. We'll break it all down, as well as the women's side. 6 games on the slate. Huge day of hockey tomorrow on the Olympic side, so be sure to come back. But with that, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. If you'd like to drop a like, if you're really serious, subscribing, tell all your friends. Comment down below your thoughts on day 2 of the men's Olympic hockey event. Until next time, see ya.